Good evening, and welcome to Intellectual Publics. My name is Ken Whitaker, and I'm coming to you from the Graduate Center at CUNY. Uh, I direct where sorry, we're getting everything together a little slowly tonight. Coming to you directly from the Graduate Center at CUNY. I direct the program along with Leslie Haynes, graduate student and jazz historian. On this night, when the Graduate Center and much of the city are closed due to the storm, I want to especially thank Leslie, running this for the first time solo, as well as Jonathan and Chris from the Grad Center IT staff, all making it possible for have this conversation at an impossible time. I myself am stuck in Chicago, having come here for college art, the art and art history meetings, but having had my plane canceled yesterday. All told, I am grateful that we can all be together in this way for what I know will be a smart, guiding, and much needed conversation. Both Jodi Byrd and Joseph Pierce have brilliant new books out from Duke University Press. Jodi Byrd's Indigenomicon, American Indians, Video Games, and the Structures of Dispossession, and Joseph Pierce, Speculative Relations, Indigenous Worlding and Repair. Each came out late last year. Nominally, they might seem to take up different topics or use different approaches, philosophical and literary, media and politics, but their paths intertwine in their focus on interrelationality and speculation, their grounding in and against settler colonial attempts to erase the peoples whose land this is. This is Lenape land, and they are here on it. Jodi and Joseph will be in conversation tonight with Audra Simpson, and who I love. And I know this is going to be a memorable and deep discussion. Sorry for confessing that in front of everyone. Uh, since we are in community here, I also want to take a minute to note the sad loss of post-colonial scholar Vince Raphael, whose work on colonialism and dictatorship in the Philippines has been path-breaking in so many ways, and for which we are really grateful. And he, like too many of our friends recently, has passed too soon. Uh, Jodi Byrd of the Chickasaw Nation is professor, Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. The research focuses on Indigenous studies, Indigenous feminist and queer studies, and video game studies. Their 2011 book, The Transit of Empire, Indigenous Critiques of Colonialism from Minnesota, won the 2011 Best First Book of the Year award from NISA and the 2012 Woodcraft Circle Award for Academic Work of the Year. Their most recent publication brings video, before mentioned Indigenomicon, which I might learn to say without stumbling, brings video game studies and Indigenous studies into conversation with Black studies, queer studies, and Indigenous feminist critique. Joseph M. Pierce, a Cherokee Nation citizen, is Associate Professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature and the founding director of the Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative at Stony Brook University. He's the author of Speculative Relations from Duke and Argentine Intimacies, Queer Kinship in an Age of Splendor from Stony Brook, and co-editor of several other things, including the GLQ issue Queer Americas, Translation, Decoloniality, and the Incommensurable. Um, with S.J. Norman, Wiradjuri, he is co-creator of the performance series Knowledge of Wounds, and in 2024 and 2025, he was Ford Foundation Scholar in Residence at MoMA, and I hope many of you got to see him there. Audra Simpson, Ganawake Mohawk Nation, is professor of anthropology at Columbia University, whose work is focused on contextualizing the force and consequences of governance through time, space, and bodies. Her research and writing is rooted within Indigenous politics in the US and Canada and crosses the fields of anthropology, Indigenous studies, American Canadian studies, gender and sexuality studies, as well as politics. She is the author of Mohawk Interruptus, Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States, from Duke University Press. Audra, Joseph, and Jodi will talk until about 7:40 or 7:45 Eastern, and then we will take questions. The chat is open, so please introduce yourselves, but also please put your questions into the Q&A, where we can find them easily rather than having to sort back through the chat. I just want to thank all three of you for being here and sharing this conversation with us. I know you've had many stages and had the conversations in many talks in many places, but it feels like this is a really important time for the conversation, and I'm really grateful for you. Thank you. Audra?
Thank you so much, Ken, for that warm introduction and thorough introduction. I'm delighted to be here to join these two scholars and friends in this discussion about their books. And I have a few framing comments, and then I have questions that they will chew on. They will start by chewing on, and I'll just start. The significance of these books within the field of Native and Indigenous studies cannot be understated. They belong firmly within this field, speaking to enduring concerns, those being the well-being of communities, the endurance and vitality of Indigenous philosophical and political thought, as well as the concerns of sovereignty and autonomy, as well as gender and sexuality in multiple registers and in multiple forms. They both instantiate the hallmarks of critique that mark the field as they grapple with pre-existing frameworks for analysis. They are robustly interdisciplinary in approach and in method. Both rely upon a practice of close reading. These are both literary scholars, as interdisciplinary as they are literary scholars. The variety of texts and materials that they bring into their frames of analysis are quite remarkable for the field. We just don't yet have studies that do this sort of work with these differentiated materials. Byrd is reading video games alongside of more readily perhaps accepted forms of literature. And Pierce is also reading photographs, film, primary documents to marshal us to points of interpretation and takeaways that are quite profound in their reach to other worlds, to repair, to care, and to an unabating commitment to the practices, in Byrd's case, to critical analysis, and perhaps in Pierce's, to reparative analysis. They never lose sight of indigeneity, and they never lose sight of queerness. And this isn't just optical, this is really foundational to these texts, while also reaching to, and for lack of a better term, holding hands with Black feminist studies, queer studies, gamer studies, or I think Jodi calls it, sorry, Jodi, video game studies. It's new to me. I'm getting and of course, literary history and studies in literature. These, I want to emphasize, are more than nods or hands waved to these fields. These are deep forms of synergy in and of themselves that mark a moment within the field of Indigenous studies of relation. I mention relation because that too is so central to both of these texts in different registers. We have before us book-length studies, but also new conceptual architecture to think and build with. We have Pierce's working of speculation, Byrd's working of grind, of disambiguation. As I worked through these books again, what I was left with was the profound push that each has performed on sturdy preconceptions. One being the game as play, as a devalued form of entertainment rather than narrative or theoretical architecture or political architecture with political effects, and for Joseph Pierce, kinship as a mutable order of law. These books sit very squarely but very actively within a subfield also within Indigenous studies known as queer Indigenous studies, or what Jodi Byrd might call it, queer feminist Indigenous studies. We might also say, as I said earlier, and I want to emphasize this to open us up perhaps on this, with this as a departure point, there is a queer center to these texts. As unstable as queerness is supposed to be, there is a queer center or a queer ethic to this. And I will just ask them about this. This may be trite. This might be too condensing, as these books do so much more. So let's get to these authors and to their conversation with each other. Jodi and Joseph, I would just like to start by inviting you to tell us what these books are up to in your own words, but also to depart from, the takeaways of the books or the interventions of the books or the matter of the books, and to ask you about their origin points in the world and what prompted them.
Audra, that was so nice. Um, Jodi, do you want to go first?
Um, you can go first.
Okay.
I feel like I want to just take in Audra's words for a second.
Yeah.
Audra. It's really wonderful to be here in this conversation. It feels really like, as Ken said, I think kind of necessary and wonderful. So thank you both.
Um, I think to, to hear that type of an introduction, and I think first of all, it's really moving to me. Um, and I think one aspect that you bring out, Audra, is how restless the books can be at times, how much, and I'll speak for myself, but how much we want to move things in different directions.
Mm.
And I would say that that has to do with part of the origin of speculative relations for me. Um, and I think I've come to be a little bit more accepting of intuition in my scholarly practice, and to try to follow those intuitions or those discomforts, those moments when you think something's not quite right, and or you know that something is not right. And for speculative relations, over and over again, I kept on feeling like kinship was too stable on the one hand, and on the other, that queer Indigenous studies was too hollow. And I think we can talk about this a little bit more, but after the sort of foundational texts of queer Indigenous studies, there's been a bit of a gap produced by pretendianism and by the ways in which um, that field has been damaged. And I wouldn't say that I want speculative relations to fill that gap. I don't think that was my aim, but rather to enact very clearly a type of ethical imperative, an ethical commitment to enlivening relations that on a really personal level is about my commitments as a Cherokee person, and on a more intellectual level is about field production without necessarily wanting it to be filling a gap in the literature. I don't think that at least when I was writing this book, I didn't want to fill a gap in the literature. I wanted to enliven possibilities that seem to have been foreclosed. And in that sense, the book for me really And I think you may also see, a really personal aspect of my history with adoption and displacement. And I'm very open about that in this book. And I write with my father and my mother, and I write with these archives of dispossession. Um, but to me, there was this really insistent dissatisfaction with the tools that I was grasping at. And so I think more so than other work that I've done, this is a methodological intervention and one that attempts to foreground relations as a method of approaching different ideas, forms, genres, schools, bodies, desires. And because that's the case, I didn't really limit myself to any one sort of object of study, right? Like if that's the form, if that's the intervention, then is it literature? Is it art? Is it archive? It became less important to stick to one and rather more important to proliferate towards those intuitions and those dissatisfactions. And my hope is that that does indicate a type of reparative gesture for people, for myself, for other people, that we don't have to start from a deficit. We don't have to start from damage. We don't have to start from loss. We can, sure, but we can also start from the beauty and the survivance and the I don't know, I was gonna say magic. I mean like magic in a non, you know, magical way. The like the vitality of our peoples. And so I'm glad that that word came into the introduction, Audra, because the vitality, the vitalness is the thing that I found motivating and moving. And I always kept on trying to come back to that. How is this alive? How do I enliven it? How do I verb this thing that is supposed to be a noun, but is not actually a noun?
Thank you, Joseph. I'm just thinking again, how wonderful it is to be here, to be thinking, and I'm really grateful, Joseph, you've already sort of addressed a little bit of the possible origins for both of our books with the void or the sort of gap in queer Indigenous studies. It's been happening within the poets and the literature and in different places and visual art and a lot of different places in activism too. But the scholarship had a bit of a overrepresentation of settler and pretendian voices, I think. And so video games for me, I'm going to give three different origins, or I don't know. It's like so many people on this webinar today have been seeing versions of this over time, and and I'm slow. And one of the origins is like, what do you do after transitive empire? And then, of course, I was like, I'll just do video games. Part of the reason video games was that it actually bought me time. I was like, this is going to be a place where I can actually sit and slow things because it's actually not always accessible to everybody in academia. And it gives me a chance to create a space against maybe the forms of scholarship that I see as land rushing, against the grafting that maybe happens that we see out of legacies of Indian territory. And just to also just say this right now, my brain is going so many different directions, but it's really profoundly amazing to be in a conversation with two of the five tribes scholars here, Cherokee and Chickasaw, to hold this down in a particular way and to think through what our location historically, geographically allows us to potentially do on these questions and how it informs so many things. The other reason I did video games or this book, it's a thread that I flag in the preface. It's directly out of the destruction of a version of American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign when Stephen Salida was fired. I also wanted the time and space to think about these discourses of genocide, of settler colonialism, and how our culture drives towards this, what Audra, you're calling the settler death drive, this constant push towards destruction, and how we can manifest and interpret it. And video games to me was a collision in 2014 where we had the Salidas on firing, we had Gamergate, and we had protests, Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson. And for me, that conflagration of moments allowed a through line to be visible with the ways in which white supremacy kind of mobilized. I'm happy to talk a lot about more of this, but the last piece is just, I think part of it grew out of a frustration that I had with Transitive Empire, that it wasn't necessarily understood as a queer text, even though I was writing it as queer. I'm too much of a Spivakian, I think, to constantly put myself into a text, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm playing with that a little in Indigenomicon to think about what it means to bring in a personal voice a little bit, to do maybe, that's what I love, Joseph, about what you allow us to have access to in your book. Um, I thought it was obvious that the book was queer, but it maybe wasn't. So when I set to do Indigenomicon, I really wanted to name a stake to say this is for queer, indigenous, feminist critique, as a through line, even if it's doing tons of other things. So I'll pause, I think, so we can keep moving the conversation.
Do you want to respond to that, Joseph, or do you want to
Yeah, I do
also
actually.
Okay,
I do.
go for it. Go for it.
One of the things that I think you're doing in that book, Jodi, and or in Indigenomicon, that I'm kind of in awe of is how you're able to take field conversations and put them in dialogue with each other in ways that are informed by a queer, feminist, indigenous framework,
Mm.
and at the same time be talking about story and play and about structures and events, and to really um, I don't know that we the way that you're able to shape conversations through
Mm.
this lens, I think to me indicates that queer indigenous studies actually has something to say about all of those fields. And this is a demonstration of how that can function and also why that is the case.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm also invigorated by the idea that queer indigenous studies, as it retains potential, even though it's had a bit of a rocky moment.
Mhm.
This is my glass half full, I guess, interpretation of it. But because of that, there's no aspect of indigenous studies or of game studies or of anthropology. Like it can be relevant to all of those fields.
Mhm.
And that's something that I think until you see it laid out in the book, I don't know that I would have even believed it, right? Like I think in theory I would have believed it, but then you see it and the way that you're able to disambiguate the ideas across all of these like big ideas,
Mhm.
small ideas to big ideas, and then big ideas back to small ideas, and that is just like it's a really masterful method, and like taking people through those. Um, Not even arguments, it's like big debates, and you're threading us through that, and that's to me indicative of how vital queer indigenous studies can be, but has not necessarily been seen as for these other bigger fields.
Mhm. Mhm. Joseph, I'm going to come back with I keep having this line from your book, love is a given, but it's not a constant.
Mhm.
Um, like, I think there's something really beautiful in the interplay between our two books, because we do share at the center this kind of speculative method, the gestural. There's, and and the ways in which you offer that up to us is an incredible act of both love and hope, I think, in a way that to hold the speculative as to let us see resistance. I think one of the things from this other side, there's like two different ways to maybe imagine queer Indigenous studies, which is through that speculative, making kinship, like exploding kind of all these different categories in ways that is controlled, but and not and still challenging of settler colonial appropriations and undermining of those things. And then there's mine and the speculative that takes us to a shitty future kind of mode. And to see that that queer Indigenous studies and queer Indigenous thought and experience can be expansive, um, and incredibly beautiful. I don't know if I'll ever write a sentence about decolonial love in a particular kind of way, because there's a part of me that's like, I don't know about love, and I really like appreciate the fact that you're like giving us that as which is absolutely in the field, and attaching it to the desire to see, land as erotic, which I think is a parallel thread to me saying land is non-normative, right? To have agency of life through that erotic, living, non-normative orientation for us in Indigenous studies. What we keep constantly trying to drive home is that when we say land is life, we're meaning something really particular, that it keeps getting misunderstood or torqued or intentionally rerouted back to property as a way for
Right.
other people to live.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Joseph,
I
do
was
you
gonna
want?
say, yeah, I was gonna say, well, one thing that you do that I wonder if you would say more about, Jodi, is how that critique of land relates to something that I find really annoying, which is object-oriented ontologies, the triple O situation,
Yeah.
which appears kind of in the middle of the book. Because I think to me, it gets to a lot of, it's like this is me being maybe a little bit shady, but it's like all of a sudden white people discovered that objects aren't really objects in the way that they've over centuries tried to make objects into objects, and then everything is animate and has power, and it's like the way that you talk about environmental studies as well as game studies in relationship to ontologies, I found fascinating, and something that I, again, like would not have thought of. Even though I think I share a skepticism about the ways that nominally decolonial ontological work is actually just like repeating some of the same sort of mythical, magical thinking that got us here in the first place.
Mm. Oh my God, that's such a big question, like object-oriented ontology. And I think it's actually sort of over already. So it's like, but I guess it's out there still. I mean, for me, the critique was really boiled down to like, why name the book Indigenomicon at all? It's like a play off of Lovecraft, who the object-oriented ontologists take as like their philosopher. They're like, let's read Lovecraft, even though he's a raving racist. He's still going to give us like a way of thinking about a ghastly cosmos of objects and animacies that are always around and acting on us. And so that's a source that they take it. And then the other side of it is the ways in which all of these things are this object-oriented ontology that's also object-oriented coding language. They overlay with each other so that the like all of these ideas from them like think that they're portable. They're like somehow this is a portable philosophy you can take from one instance to another. You can just slot in indigeneity, slot in feminism, and it fails to really understand that there's actually a radical difference, I think, even in what object-oriented ontology is offering us and what our philosophies actually are, which brings us back, I think, to what your work is showing us, which is what is required to
Mm,
understand the act of making relation. Um, I think there's a way that object-oriented ontology refuses relation. It's like non-correlative. I mean, it's pushing towards a denial of relationality, which
yeah.
for us is the like I think. Um, or at least reading your speculative relations, the work that we have to actually do, that worlding is embedded into the requirement of understanding the responsibilities that come with relation. So
I
I'll
mean, I
put it
think
back
there
to
it's
you.
it no, it's almost like you have there's a humility that's required there
Right.
to,
Yeah.
and a susceptibility. I think at some point I talk about porosity,
Mhm.
where I have to be able to be affected by the um, desires of other beings or other forces that are outside of myself. But I
Mhm.
think the humility there is a I don't want to say prerequisite, but it's I think a big part of being able to understand that our epistemologies and ontologies are predicated on relations rather than on naming objects as such. So it's not about taxonomy, but rather relationality. And because of that, we have to also be in motion. Like we have to be in relation is to be responsive also at the same time to the political orders that are happening, to use some of Audra's language,
Mhm.
around bodies
Mhm.
and desires as a crucial part of that. So again, we're coming back to how does queer Indigenous studies intervene in these types of conversations about and I in the introduction, Audra, you like mentioned the word law, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm not talking about law, but maybe I am, right? Like I think there's a way in which when we talk about relations and the responsibilities that our relations require of us and which we instantiate in our languages, ceremonies, as well as quotidian, you know, um, engagements. Um, that's also about upholding the particularities of our peoplehood, which is about upholding our laws as people and our responsibilities as people.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that there, we're like the stakes become really high. They can be, and the implications can be really broad. And that's something that I think too is really interesting. If I can say about these two books is I think the implications can actually be really broad.
Mhm.
Some of the analysis is pretty granular, but the implications of methodologically can actually take us to lots of different places.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm itching to just ask both of you to drill a little on the genealogies of thought that inform speculation
Mhm.
and Jodi, this word that I'm trying to get my head around, disambiguation,
Mhm.
which seems to be could also be demystifying, revealing, etc. And I want
Mhm.
to understand the specificities in which you use these terms and the work that they do in the text, but also as you imagine these possibilities beyond the text, because these are such aspirational, these analyses demand a kind of application beyond the text.
Mhm.
Um, and I wonder if you can do that for a bit with us or for us.
Mhm.
I I think this is a good space for me to confess that it took me a little bit to feel comfortable with the word speculation.
Mhm.
I was seduced by speculation. I thought it was really suggestive, but to really think that that was the core of the book because it's a Greek word originally. I was thinking I wanted to, like what Cherokee word am I gonna like home in on as the theory for the book and I think I realized that I didn't need to do that. I think what I needed to do was attempt to reflect a Cherokee ethics and Cherokee thought in the book. And that didn't have to be the one core key term that the book was theorizing. It didn't have to be that. And so when I kind of allowed myself to be a little bit more capacious with how I was thinking about that, then I became more and more convinced that the act of speculation contains within it a broad range of possibilities. And from its translations from ancient Greek to Latin to Romance languages to English and other languages, other non-Romance languages, it's undergone variation. But at its core, it has this ambiguity or this friction, this grind between seeing yourself in a mirror as in a reflection and seeing out. So there's this double vision that is really crucial to speculation. It's never just a flight of fancy. It always actually has something to do with thinking beyond and thinking inside. And so for me, that actually led me to Laura Harjo's work on stars and spiral to the star, and like and thinking within a southeastern cosmos where we do have relationships with star gazing, star positioning, star stories, and Kai Recollet and Emily Johnson, and there are other people that have been thinking about sort of multi-scalar or multi-dimensional relations. And for me, that just made a lot of sense in terms of positioning oneself in relation means that you are where you are, but then to imagine something, you have to think outside of yourself. And that then I think allowed me to really ground speculation because it's not financial speculation. It's not even speculative fiction. I'm sorry, but I don't deal with speculative fiction. I deal with speculation as a method that I think can apply to speculative fiction. But my interest was in a kind of speculative methodology, speculative practice that today, most recently, I think you could see in speculative fiction and in speculative finance. But for the last kind of, long time, it's been more about sight and insight, about looking beyond a horizon and looking at oneself in self-reflection. And so this kind of, I don't know if mirroring is necessarily right because it's also there's like a vibration that's happening between them. That to me was really suggestive of not settling on a single method or a single object of study or a single definition of something, but rather opening up to possibilities where we may not have expected there to be possibilities. So the gestures of worlding or of repair, I think are possible because of the freedom that comes from not being reduced to a singular taxonomic definition of self or of object of study, of photograph, of work of art, of history, but always sort of toggling back and forth between the two, which means that we're like it's a relational practice, is what I realized. Is speculation is a relational practice. Stop.
Oh my goodness. I want to come back to the futurisms of what we're
Yeah.
at some point, because I know there's things to say there. One of the things I loved about like just like thinking about these two books together, and thinking about Kai Riccole's work, yours on stars, and what they mean. There's a moment in Indigenomicon in chapter 3 where I really am kind of grinding on a Maori video game, Umurangi Generation, where they give us a apocalypse, but there's ancestors with galaxies in their bodies on the shore. And I love that, Joseph, your book actually would have helped me read that better, and added to it, in the ways in which all of these things attest to that kind of speculation that you're talking about of relation. To come to disambiguation, after the book is out, I know I've understood I'm writing a trilogy at this point where I see like interweavings between Transit of Empire and this one and the third book that is starting to take a form. Um, and after the book came out and I've been talking about it, I'm like, oh, enjambment this. I was like, disambiguation is actually in some ways just cacophony reframed in a different way, because it's asking us to hold the pieces of all these different meanings to track how we're moving through things. And it came out of, similar sorts of conversations with people. Like, when you use relation as an idea, everyone's like, well, there's glissant. They point to different, intellectual histories, and you have to, and I found myself having to say, well, yes, absolutely, but this too. And so I wanted, to say, why is that kind of the mode that happens when we sit to chart an indigenous methodology or indigenous critique? What is having to be defined within and against and through and in alliance and solidarities, however we think about it, in order to make legible all these things that we're trying to convey about what indigenous philosophies, relations actually mean. And so that's what prompted me to do disambiguation. And then, that to get to that website, there's a website for the Chickasaw. I mean, when you start to see it's like embedded into the ways you navigate Wikipedia, the flattening of all these meanings, we can point to you know, the ways in which we use civility now, the ways in which there is no truth. I mean, there's lots of ways to bring this into an analysis of the present, but I think this has been with us for a lot longer. I think that this is part of settler colonialism. This is a denial of indigenous worlds that lead us to and through removal to allotment. Anyway, so having paths to manage these forces that are like trying to confuse or misdirect or ask us to oppress others so that we can advance ourselves within this whole system. That was part of what disambiguation was letting me do. Yeah.
Jodi, thank you so much for that. I hope my students are here to hear this, because we're reading these books. We're closing out my graduate seminar with these books, and it's just such a gift to hear you deepen our understanding of these concepts and what they're up to. And it's so exciting to hear that there's a trilogy and we can see a kind of arc of thought, in the ways in which you move from transit to this holding of these concepts together, that also, not concepts, this project of tracking. You're giving us conceptual architecture to track, but at the same time, within that, you're saying something quite important. Well, to me also, I don't know if it's to others. Joseph is such a loving scholar. Like, it's in the book. The book, it just is such a loving text. And I myself am a killer. I'm a critical analyst. Sorry, and I want to kill that stuff that's killing us. But and to not contain always having to route our stuff through others. How many times I've been told Glissant thought it better than I in a different way. It's not a compliment, to, oh, have you read Glissant? Like the refusal, like it's thought better elsewhere or something. I think that's what's being implied or suggested. And I get it. There are other ways of thinking about these things elsewhere, but there is this way in which I think indigenous thought or critique is only understood via others.
Mm.
And so I appreciate your kind of languaging there and the conceptual architecture that you're giving us to do that kind of critical analysis also. And this is no diss to Glissant. I recognize the hugeness of this, right? And Glissant is in both of these books.
Yeah.
You, as I mentioned in the introduction, are holding hands with,
Yeah.
multiple thinkers and fields themselves in really remarkable ways. Yeah, so the future, or the
Yeah.
future, or the futurity, or the no futures. I've been, I had to do this thing for Billy Barry Belcourt, and I have new students that I'm working with. I'm trying to understand the way futures operating in queer studies, the ways it's operated as an instrument of domination in this so-called taming of the American West. It literally is the language of American manifest destiny, the great nation of futurity, right? This notion of progress, which just ground Indigenous folks down. And it shows up, magically in Indigenous studies. I blame it on Twitter. I blame everything on Twitter. About 10 years ago, it was like the futurity crew. And I see you two departing from that in really significant ways. I just want to invite you to to tell us something about time and the future and how you think about it
Mm.
in these texts or in general.
I want to jump in here just really fast to say we've had
Yeah.
this um, little piece of gesturing towards the problem of pretendianism, and I suspect we'll come back one more time for another pass with the ways in which that has taken up space in queer Indigenous studies. But there's a way in which that's actually had an impact in Indigenous futurisms and Indigenous video game studies. So one of the challenges, I want to just say that one of the challenges of thinking about all of this, and when I say there's this land rushing or the grafting or whatever we might call it, just this way in which intellectual work is itself part of territorializing out some of these ideas and then requiring a citational pathway that kind of inserts certain scholars over others in it. And when I really struggled with this book because I'm claiming I'm writing Indigenomicon, the image of the law of the Indian that's a play, or the Indigenous that's a play on H.P. Lovecraft, which is supposed to be the book of the names of the dead. So everything is supposed to be in this tome, which is impossible because indigeneity is such a global concept. And I'm writing, I think I say at one point, as a Chickasaw whose commitments are to literal grounds in what is now Mississippi. Spoilers for what the third book is too. So thinking about where does that go to Indigenous futures? You know, it it's just it's such a frustration to be working on a book and wanting to name Indigenous continuity and endurance and presence and survivance, if we use Gerald Visner, and to run into people who are not honest about who they are and how that affects what we can imagine about the past, the present, and the future. I think that's partly what drew me to this problem of shitty futures, of the real implications of loss and environmental destruction that is absolutely in front of us. And I was really curious about, why so much of Indigenous uh, literary genres head towards that. Um, and even in those questions, certain writers that you think you can cite because you think they're native end up not being, and everything becomes really hard. So I just want to say that the way I was grappling with shitty futures and what to call it, and I think at various points, I use shitty futures because it's coming out of the video game, but I also turn to Daniel Heath Justice's Wonderworks because there's a way that the wonder work can hold a kind of speculative or wonder. I mean, wonder can be horror or awe. It can be disambiguated in different ways away from just anyway. So I want to see what Joseph wants to give us in that, but I'm throwing out a little bit of a provocation around a problem that I think our field has with our intellectual genealogies.
Well, let me take up intellectual genealogies. So I was starting out, my approach to queer theory comes through a healthy skepticism about Anglo English, uh, Anglophone queer theory. Um, and by virtue of my um, formal academic training as a Latin Americanist, in which a lot of um, the like my filter of that, I think, was a little bit different than would have happened in an English department, for example. Um, and but also of the time when the kind of Edelman Munoz no future debates were um, really happening and had a major impact in queer theory, queer studies, and um, I think that the possibilities of futurity for queer studies became a bit of a luxury, or were from the outset. It was almost a luxury to be able to theorize futurity from the position of a peoples who were always guaranteed the option of a future or not. Whereas we who are the survivors of the apocalypse, that future is not something that normative future that was never guaranteed. And so I don't think that within settler colonial contexts, people of color, and in this case, particularly indigenous people, can have the same type of relationship with time and temporality and futurity as white people have, particularly in the sense that when we're talking about queer studies, it's almost as if the possibility of some ungrasped horizon on the future is so comfortable when placed in a settler colonial context. That is not the case for indigenous perspectives when when we consider how the legal structures that through which our um, polities are defined within the United States are not actually stable because the treaties are violated constantly, and because at any moment the rights that were negotiated can be uh, upturned, overturned, and upended. And so, but that being said, I mean that kind of felt negative. That being said, um, I'm like a big mushy person, and I want possibilities. I want desperately for Native people to have the tools to be able to imagine what we want our futures to be. And that I think does mean being able to name the colonial structures that continue to dispossess us and to render us spectral and to eliminate us from our own lands and epistemologies and our languages, etc., to remove us. Um, but at the same time, I think that futurity is not necessarily a one-way. It's not a singular direction for indigenous epistemologies. Futurity can also be cyclical. It can be backwards. It can be multiply directional. And so really the singular horizon of settler futurity is the thing that really conditions the possibilities for white queer theories, queer futurity. So if that's the case, then I think that a queer Indigenous studies or a queer approach through Indigenous studies to futurity is one that has to include from our epistemologies and ontologies the ways in which when we talk about future, we're not talking about the same future as settlers. We're talking about futures from within our stories that may, it may be a long ass time from now. Like the question of time, I think is it's so different because we're not measuring in decades, we're measuring in millennia. And so we like I mean, I don't know. I just love it when the one thing I'll say about the Twitter wars is like maybe, like when the white people on Twitter are like, but but like, we've been talking about we've been doing this or we've been theorizing futurity for millennia. So like, you know, it's gonna be okay. Like we're gonna keep doing what we're doing and like and maybe um and maybe some of these tools will help us have a less colonial world. Maybe that demands refusal. Maybe that demands possibility and speculation. Maybe that demands disambiguation. Maybe all of them. I think, one thing I really love about Cherokee history is there's always a kind of right to refuse. Like that's like a political um, uh, kind of right that in non-coercive governments, you can always say no. And I think that is something that I think also applies to when we're talking about futurity, right? Like there's a way in which no, not that. But then that also opens up the possibility for something else. So saying no to this future actually can bring us to some other possibility, some other speculative engagement. It may not be futurity. Maybe it's something else. I don't know. I feel like I rambled on that one, but I'm gonna stop.
Mhm.
Jodi, do you want to respond to that and maybe say something about the genealogy question and bodies
Sure.
of, the bodies of literature that we're drawing on at times that become evacuated
Mhm.
suddenly or
I mean,
not?
I really, really appreciated Joseph you laying out that genealogy through queer theory like that and that hasn't necessarily engaged indigeneity, even if it's not necessarily always white. It's
Yeah.
certainly kind of framed through, settler or arrivant experiences that don't really quite know how to account for what we're talking about, which is a grounded relationality to what it means to be on land and in relationship to land, as something other than property. So I really, really appreciated that. And I think that's the thing that is part of, that gap and void that you were also mentioning, which is that there hasn't been a very like we haven't had within the critical theory yet. And maybe this is our gesture towards a possibility and a kind of speculative future work towards it, in our two pieces in this conversation, because we haven't really had a chance as Indigenous queer scholars to define for ourselves what our methods actually are, what our questions actually are, um, and we so then we're now having to kind of define ourselves against maybe, or trying again to disambiguate around what would be those intentional differences with readers who may not be able to tell the difference between what we're doing and what here's where I'm like, should I use a name like I don't know, um, like Driscoll maybe? I'll set that one into this a little bit to say, it's a lot of work, to chart pathways in an expectation of an ontological embodiment of difference for consumption.
The a pretendian can't have embodiment. Like they can't have relationality because they don't have embodiment.
Mhm.
And so because of that, I think this may answer a previous question that Audra had about like what are some of the potential abuses of speculation? Like is it not possible that someone could come along and say, well, I'm just speculating on who my ancestors were?
Mhm.
I think that's true. Like that's a real um, pitfall. But you can't have reciprocity without being part of the polity that grounds the possibilities of your relations. So even if you do that, you're just making it up. And so you can't have embodiment within the framework of your people, your ground, unless you have that form of relation, that form of embodied practice that is part of not who you are. And this I learned actually fairly recently is the questions that emerge from people like Driscoll and other pretendians. It's who am I? And the question we're asking is not who am I, it's what am I and how am I? And in what ways am I already mutually imbricated in the ongoing process of Indigenous uh, belonging, reciprocity, ontology, epistemology. So the who am I is a question that marks an individual stance vis-a-vis the question of identity, which is a moot point for Indigenous ontologies because there is no possibility of an indigenous of a singularity of of a single belonging in a relational context. So I think, this is also where, we've mentioned Daniel before and Daniel Heath Justice, I think in some of his writing on relations reminds us that to be a good relative or to be in good relations is to demonstrate your humanity, and to be human, therefore, is to be in relation within the context of an indigenous culture. And so not that's not to generalize, to overgeneralize, but I think the things that pretendians can never have are relations,
Mhm.
but what they assert is identity. And we're not talking about identity. We're talking about relations, which means that I'm allowing that I am what I am by virtue of our shared understanding and our shared history and there's a sharing there. That's like the core of it. And so it's not something that I can really I don't know, that's all I have to say about that. I said it.
Um, I think maybe I'll just add in this because we keep using ground and relational, just to say, in the play and the disambiguation that I tried to do in Indigenomicon with that, with grounded relationality is, and in doing that and talking about it more and more now that the book is out, and something I wish I would have put in the book too, is just, in the play, in the grind off of Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson in their use of grounded normativity. That's a definition of sovereignty, right?
Mhm.
And it's potentially what's meant by when we say indigenous sovereignty, as the counter-distinction to state sovereignty, and colonial sovereignty. We do mean these things like grounded relations, or it has. I'm going to not deal with the normative right now, but I think some of what you're saying, Joseph, is that there's a way in which, in the focus on identity, there's a refusal of sovereignty, because that
Mhm.
sovereignty has to be done through that ground and that relational place. And that's what gets constantly missed. It gets replaced. It gets filled in this assumption that it's property. I mean, it's
Yeah,
the same thing as land. It's all
right,
property, right?
right.
The settler structure of this that makes it dispossessable.
Mm. That's part of the thingification of it,
Mhm.
right? Like it's the way that to reduce relations to a thing.
Mhm.
I think um I think I kind of continue, and also because I'm more of a, maybe I'm, my first book is about the 19th century and the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. I'm really focused sometimes on taxonomy as like the invention of some of these
Mhm.
terms and labels in museums as well as in some of the archival collections. But I think the invention of taxonomy and the invention of, or is part of this process of thingification, which is also something that this is exactly what pretendians are doing. They're thingifying as an identity something that could never, that is never just an identity.
Right.
Excellent. I think we're now at the point, rather sadly, because I think we could go on, where we will open the conversation up to questions. And but before we do so, I just want to invite you to, if you have any closing points that you'd like to make. This was really quite a nice move through both the books, the issue, what informs the books, and then some of the conceptual architecture in the books, and then of course beyond. And if you want to close with something, I'm just offering you if you want to.
Mhm.
And then for the folks who are formulating questions, we're asking for them in the Q&A rather than the chat.
I wanted to appreciate Jodi's refusal of binaries and refusal of uh, gold rushing, and appreciate the pleasure of play. That's something that I think pleasure and love and desire is something that I have tried to do too. But I think I
Mhm.
just wanted to say thank you for
Mhm.
helping me see that in a lot of these different ways.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I want to say thanks back, Joseph. I mean, there's a way in which, I was like, we were joking in the I don't know if I should reveal this, like about grinding, because I mean, about, and whether that actually evokes grinder, or, I mean, we're back to land as desire. There's like the playfulness of that. I mean, I think there's like ways to really pull out an erotics of some of this work that is, I part of what I think is the core of what maybe we're imagining for a queer Indigenous studies together in this conversation, even, and as a step towards maybe a hope for that. So I'm just so grateful, Joseph, for your work, for what, and for your real insistence on worlding as the reparative for us, and that there's a possibility of instantiating the worlds we actually want. I'm too much. I joke about being a pessimist and an Indigenous pessimist, and I have a whole thing in that book about like why that
Yeah.
can't actually exist. And I think there's probably things to say here too about the importance. I think that both of us show about as Southeastern Indians that we are committed to be thinking with Black and Indigenous studies together because of the fact that we're in those lands that were destroyed and stripped through slavery, and our tribe's own participation in that.
Yeah.
So I just am so grateful that we're the ones getting to be in this conversation and really
Mm.
doing what I said, which is that I think we have a unique way of offering like insights into what we're up against and what keeps revealing its face to us, and all the things that Audra also critiques. So,
Yeah.
okay, questions from the audience.
Yeah. Questions.
Thank you. So I will move through some of these questions for us to consider. We have anonymous attendees. Number one, as a PhD student, I'm very interested in being intentional about methodology. Joseph and Jodi, I'd love to hear more about how you perceive the difference in terms of method and intent between responding to, quote, a gap in the literature and, quote, enlivening possibilities, especially if in terms of an anti-colonial approach, the impossible to imagine has never been part of canonical literature. does intuition not fill, this is how Joseph started, right, with intuition. Does intuition not rewrite a gap, or is in your method, is your very method above the formalisms of academic research? Do you want to chew on that for a minute and I'll,
No, I think I can answer that pretty quickly.
okay, right on.
I think some of this gets at um, what I'm going to use the word packaging, but take that with a grain of salt. Not everything has to be a book. Some things are better as an article or an op-ed or a work of art. Um, the gap in the literature, I think, is a very standard way of approaching an academic article, and sometimes that's what is warranted in that way. I don't really have a problem with the gap in the literature. I've done a gap in the literature before. This book is not my tenure book. It's my second book, and I don't have the pressures of filling a gap in the literature. I didn't have to do that. So there's a, I think, I don't know, how do we call that? It's a different time and in my life in which I did feel like I had more freedom to not necessarily um, fill typical academic justifications for scholarship. At the end, and for the Duke people here, right? Like I did have to, we do end up justifying these things. We do end up writing the proposals and responding to the reports and everything, and we do end up finding ways to articulate what the interventions are. Um, but in this case, I didn't. I was more interested, and I was able to articulate that the methodology itself was the intervention, and the gap in the literature didn't need to be the intervention. And so I would say that there's kind of a time and a place for that.
Um, I just want to think too, because Joseph, I really appreciated the ways in which you evoked intuition,
Mm,
like alongside the speculation. You know, I mean, I think I try to, I, I don't know, as a writer writing these books that I write, I always, I always know I can't really give it out too early because the feedback is going to basically say, we don't understand why you're doing all the things you're doing. And also, how are you making it all make sense? And my response is, I don't know. It's just kind of going to happen. And I have a vision. And it might be intuition. Sometimes I have named it ancestors. I think that there's a way
yeah.
in which there's a lot of things that are part of our stories and family and relations that are actively asking us to take up certain questions. Um, I think I think the thing that's so hard about academic timings, and I don't know what happens as we watch academia transform yet into whatever's happening right now. Um, but I think we always get rushed because it is such a like a it's like a everybody's making a name, making a trademark, making a citational trail. And I think sometimes we have to think on bigger scales. Um, right. So it took 10 years to write one book. I mean, back to like maybe it's a millennia, maybe these intuitions require that sense of a different temporality and a different future or a different like a different I want to say orientation, but I hate the word, so I don't know. All right.
There's a related question that's both general but it'll be interesting to see what you have. I'm going to fold two into the other. Anonymous attendee tells us that they really enjoyed the comment about natives, how native scholars haven't been able to articulate their methods and questions.
Mm.
And they invite you to tell us whether you see this changing. I'm thinking this is interesting in light of like Tuhiwai Smith's book, right? and the Wilson books on methods. So, and then also just this like grand invitational question, what do you think is the future of Indigenous studies? Right. So like dig into that. It's a bit of a
When I tried to be really clear about how I was using the terms that I am using in this book, speculation, relations, worlding, repair. And one of the things that I think that has happened as I have grown as a writer is to try to be considerate for readers, which isn't to say like to like simplify things that aren't simple, but it's to try to find moments in which I will try to reach out toward a reader. Um, and those were moments in which I thought I was trying to be really clear about like what am I saying and how am I saying it and why am I saying it. I don't know that, and maybe this is an idiosyncratic thing that I'm doing. I don't think so, but I wanted to be really clear in this book about how I was using these key terms. So I defined them in the beginning and I tried to like be really clear as I'm going through. That took some doing. It took some time. It wasn't like that in the first draft. It got better as I revised and rewrote um and who knows, maybe the reader will not see it that way, but I think that that quality in my mind was me trying to extend care towards the reader. So that's how I thought about it, and I imagine other people will think about that in different ways. Articulating the methodologies, can be really dry. It can be like, here's my methodology section, but I think that's also a disciplinary thing, where that's not in native studies. How do we, what are the conventions for that? Um, are we butting up against the conventions or are we expanding the conventions? My use of personal narration in this book, I think, is another one of those where there are many examples of creative works as well that use first person narrative. But I really wanted this book to be a little bit hybrid, a little bit of a sort of mixed genre type of book that is not that in which I'm not afraid to be clear about who I am and what I am in relation to these things, and to also let people in on some of the thought process of how I'm thinking about these things.
I just write really long sentences to annoy everyone. And I say that, but then I'm also like, I think that I think, Joseph, I love how you have the whole section on love, actually, also just a breakdown and meditation on poets.
Yeah.
And I think one of the favorite things I found in all the pieces of what goes into Indigenomicon is Layli Long Soldier saying that she wanted opaque to mean transparent as a kind of counterpoint to glissant and opacity. And I like, what do you do with Indigenous people when we want transparency? I mean, there's a certain kind of, and I think that I don't know what the future of Indigenous studies and our questions and methodologies are, but I think it's really fascinating to me that that's like something she pulled out of a disambiguation or a making meaning or counter in a word like opaque to say it always should have, like she always felt it should have been transparent, that's what it really should mean.
Mm.
And why it is that as Indigenous peoples, I think we actually want some level of transparency, or like a way to have us, as much as we refuse to have also a, hey, ask us who our ancestors are, ask us who we're related to, like that's actually like, ask us which tribe we are. We're presumed
Mhm.
dead. We want to actually, tell you. We're happy to tell you. We want to tell you things. So I don't know. So I think the future will still be us kind of earnestly trying to think, how do we actually tell people we're here?
Mm.
if I can just go to this question that's right on the nose for what you just said, Jodi, from Professor Redmond here at Columbia, offers her greetings to you both and is saying that she's wondering how you might understand your new work differently upon its release in this political moment. And what kinds of juxtapositions or reading practices do you want for it under the circumstances?
Mm-hmm. I'll jump in for this one too, because like one of the things that was really, I finished the book as Trump took office last year. And video games are kind of the blood and sweat and tears of the white supremacist Elon Musk's make games great again. He was literally tweeting these things out um, as I was writing the book and giving me evidence for why this is potentially relevant to the present. I think, what do I want? Juxtapositions and reading practices. I think we have a tendency to, in this moment, diagnose through European history. I think a kind of refusal to understand what's happening as a continuance of American history, to really see this, to see in this moment a need to turn to Indigenous and Black thought for sites of interpretation and resistance instead of always giving us World War II, fascism, like to see the continuities of what produced Trump and our present. Because it's, I mean, I could say so much. I could say so much about intruder. Like there's so many things that we could level down into around, the ways in which settler colonialism and indigeneity and nativism and all these things are at work still. And even as people will tell us, Indians are, we're so, sorry, indigenous nations, we're so limited, we're so small, we don't really matter anymore. But we are the interpretive frame, I think.
I think that makes sense, Jodi, and is a thread that comes from transit, right? And that brings and that you're carrying through here. Um, I had a moment where, as I was finishing up some of the writing for the book, I really, well, as I was finishing up the kind of first big full draft of the book, Christina Sharp invited me to participate in the alchemy lecture series and invited me to write a manifesto. And I took that as an opportunity to modulate a little bit or to speculate a little bit more directly on what are some of the, like, maybe more direct, um, like speaking directly to people about the present. And that iteration, I think, also helped me when I went back to the like the big book part, be okay with not necessarily speaking to the present, but being open to a book intervening in the present. So I think that for me, the if-then statements at the end of the book in the epilogue are really the way that I try to invite people to take what is here and and move it into the spaces that where you feel like you might need it and where it can be useful or generative for you, um, as a small gesture that I think can be continued. And I think, you may you may think about a riff in that case where the if-then statement, which also does kind of appear in Jodi's work, thinking about the language of coding. Um, but in my case, it was a grammatical speculation. And so I think that the grammar is a place where we can find tools that can be applied in different scenarios. Because the thing, let me just finish with this. The thing that I find the most um, difficult about not the, forget I said that, but one issue that I find really difficult is the constant reactivity towards things that whatever is the next bullshit thing that happens, and it's a tweet and it's a this and it's a that. And this is not to say that we don't have politics of intervention or of being responsive. But if everything that we do is always in response to some bullshit racist thing that happens, then we're never able to be Indians doing Indian things, which is another shorthand that I think I've developed for worlding. So, like if we're Indians doing Indian things, then we're relating, and because we are relating, then we are capable, then we are capacitating ourselves to be able to respond to those things, but from our own positions rather than this headline, then this headline, then this headline, then this headline. I realize that may not be a satisfactory sort of answer, but I think that um, I do see speculative relations as something that intervenes in the present. I'm just not sure um, in what areas it will intervene. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. Jodi, do you want to chew on that a bit? And then we should probably come to a close.
Um, I'm like where I went with Indians doing Indian things. There's like not to take this back to TikTok or Twitter, but maybe to die on the social media moment. There's this great account that is doing basically a play of Red Dead Redemption and things off of it. So just say there I was minding my indigenous business, and then it just then basically having to kick everyone's ass in the game world. I think what I love about the worlding is that I think we're all of us desperate to have some sense of some kind of hope in the face and a sense that something so is going to be so bad that it's going to break people out or break them open into some other kind of resistance. And I think I hope for that too, but as I read and see the history of Mississippi or Oklahoma, Indian Territory into Oklahoma, I kind of wonder what the tolerance is of this nation for the constant degradation and violence and dehumanization. Um, so I don't know. I want to end on something positive to say, what do I want? What do I hope for? And what do I want? And I think I want us all to keep thinking together and keep talking. I think these are the precious things that we have. We're not necessarily being given time to think. We are, as Joseph's saying, forced into a kind of reactive stance. Then the more we can reflect, I think the better we are going to be in responding.
Mm. Maybe the last thing I can say is I think that, and this is a little bit in to draw on a comment that Jacqueline Sparks had in the comments, is that I think that if I consider myself as a possibility that my ancestors dreamed, then I can also have a responsibility towards them and towards others in the future. And that is not being reactive. That's me being responsive and having reciprocal obligations towards people who dreamed me into the future. And perhaps that's hopeful. But also, I think it's kind of the beauty of who we are and how we have resisted as Southeastern peoples, um, removals and removals and removals and um, legal structures that were never meant to serve us, and allotment and adoption and all of it. Um, Through it all, we have possibilities because of our stories and our grounding, and that's the thing that I think we have to keep the closest to.
I'm just really grateful for this whole conversation. you see the brilliant books, you feel like, oh, they're so smart, which they are. And then to have like the space for this, and then just like the ideas that keep popping up that I know I'll be thinking about for days in advance. And I just want to thank you all for being here and being willing to do it. Jodi, Joseph, Audra, thank you for your great guidance and questioning, and everybody for being in the conversation, because I feel like just the way you've summarized it and the kind of interaction and relation and that being the present that we need is just a real gift. So thank you very much. And wishing good night to everybody, and thank you for being here.